Daniel sat behind the wheel of his car, the radio humming softly as he drove along the dark, winding road. The headlights illuminated the stretch of asphalt in front of him, but beyond that, there was nothing but an impenetrable blackness that seemed to swallow everything whole. He had been driving for hours, heading towards the remote mountains, chasing a lead that had been keeping him awake for days. The case was unlike anything he'd ever investigated. Reports of strange disappearances on this isolated road had begun to circulate. Drivers, hikers, and even long-haul truckers had vanished without a trace, leaving their vehicles abandoned and no clues behind. Daniel, always drawn to mysteries that others shied away from, was determined to uncover the truth. He had already spoken to the families of a few of the missing people, and though their stories varied, there was one detail they all shared: a strange transmission heard over the radio before the disappearance. As Daniel thought about the cases, a crackle interrupted the steady hum of his car's radio. The familiar static that came with losing a signal in such a remote area was something he expected, but what he heard next sent a chill down his spine. "Help, please. I'm trapped. I can't find my way out." The voice was faint, distorted by static, but unmistakably human. He turned the dial, trying to catch a clearer signal, but the voice faded in and out. His heart raced as he listened more closely. "Please, it's too late. It's me. It's you." Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel as confusion and a strange sense of dread washed over him. He had heard about odd radio signals in remote areas before, but this was different. The voice on the other end, it sounded eerily like his own. No, that wasn't possible. It had to be some kind of mistake. Perhaps the frequency was picking up interference, a trick of the mountains and the isolation. But the message was so clear. It was pleading for help, for him to turn back, to avoid something terrible. He glanced at the road signs. The stretch of highway had grown increasingly desolate, no signs of civilization for miles. Fog began to roll in, thick and suffocating, clinging to the trees that lined the road. The world seemed to shrink around him, leaving nothing but the narrow beam of his headlights and the suffocating silence of the road. "Help! It's me," the voice repeated once more, before the radio fell silent, replaced by the monotonous static once again. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his chest as he processed what he'd just heard. He wanted to shake it off as some strange coincidence, but he couldn't ignore the knot of unease tightening in his stomach. There was something wrong about this place, something that pulled at the edges of his mind, whispering that he was headed towards something dark, something dangerous, but he wasn't the type to turn back. Not when he was so close. Taking a deep breath, Daniel steeled himself, pressing down harder on the gas pedal as he drove further into the night. The road ahead stretched endlessly, twisting and turning as though it had no true destination. His headlights caught glimpses of crumbling road signs and faded mile markers, each one a reminder that he was venturing deeper into uncharted territory. The fog thickened, swirling around his car like a living thing. Daniel's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror. Behind him, the road was obscured, as if the fog were deliberately concealing the way back. His mind raced, replaying the distorted voice over and over. He glanced at the radio once again, half expecting the eerie transmission to return. It didn't. Instead, there was only the low hum of the car and the unsettling quiet of the empty road ahead. Daniel felt a creeping sense of isolation settle over him. The stories of the disappearances, the abandoned vehicles and the drivers who vanished into thin air, they weighed heavily on his thoughts. He couldn't help but wonder if he was following in their footsteps, unknowingly walking into the same trap that had ensnared them all. He checked his phone, but of course, there was no signal. The road had cut him off from the world, leaving him completely alone with nothing but the darkness and the ever-present fog to keep him company. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he approached what appeared to be an old rundown gas station in the distance. The faint light from a flickering neon sign was barely visible through the fog. His instincts told him to stop, to take a moment to regroup and figure out his next move. He pulled into the station, the tires crunching against the gravel as he slowed to a stop. The place looked deserted, The windows of the small building dark and dusty. An old gas pump stood crookedly by the entrance, its paint peeling from years of neglect. Daniel stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at his skin. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows, but the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves carried by the wind. As he approached the door of the gas station, he hesitated for a moment, his mind replaying the strange voice on the radio. Who had sent the transmission? Was it really just a coincidence? Or was there something more to it, something that tied the voice to this place? Taking a deep breath, Daniel pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The door creaked as Daniel stepped into the dimly lit interior of the gas station. The staleness of the air hit him first, thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he could make out rows of empty shelves, the products long since gone. It was as though the place had been abandoned for years, yet the flickering neon sign outside and the faint light from an old lamp by the counter suggested otherwise. He approached the counter, noticing a small bell that looked like it hadn't been rung in ages. Hesitant, Daniel tapped the bell once, its metallic chime sounding unnaturally loud in the eerie stillness. For a moment, there was no response, just silence. But then, from somewhere in the back, he heard the slow shuffle of footsteps. His pulse quickened as a figure emerged from the shadows. An old man, stooped and weathered, appeared behind the counter. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, and his clothes looked as though they hadn't been changed in years. He stared at Daniel with a strange intensity, his gaze sharp despite his frail appearance. "Not many come through here," the man said in a low, raspy voice. Daniel hesitated, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. I just needed a place to stop for a moment," he replied, glancing around the empty station. "Strange road. It feels like it goes on forever." The old man's expression darkened, and he shook his head slowly. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the warning. "What do you mean?" "You need to turn back," the old man said, his voice growing more urgent. "This road, it doesn't lead anywhere good. If you keep going, you'll end up like the others." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. "The others?" The old man nodded gravely. "You've heard the stories, haven't you? People who disappear, drivers who are never seen again. They all pass through here, thinking they could outrun it. But the road, it has a way of trapping you. There's no escape once you go too far." Daniel felt a knot of unease tighten in his chest. The voice on the radio, the endless stretch of road, and now this cryptic warning. It was all beginning to feel too real, too connected. He glanced at the old man, searching his face for any sign of deception, but the fear in the man's eyes was unmistakable. "What happened to them?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man's gaze shifted, his eyes clouded with a deep, unsettling sadness. "They vanished, left their cars behind, just disappeared. Some say the road took them. Others say they're still out there, trapped in some kind of loop, reliving the same drive over and over again." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Could that explain the voice on the radio? Was someone out there, trapped in this cycle, trying to warn him? Before he could ask more questions, the old man's eyes widened, and he reached across the counter, grabbing Daniel's arm with surprising strength. "You have to leave," he hissed. "Now, before it's too late." Daniel pulled his arm free, taking a step back. "Wait, what are you talking about? Why should I believe any of this?" The old man's face twisted into a grim expression. "Because I've seen it happen over and over. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But if you stay here, if you keep driving down that road, you'll never find your way out." Daniel stared at the old man, his heart pounding in his chest. Part of him wanted to dismiss the warning, to chalk it up to the ramblings of a crazy old man living in the middle of nowhere. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. "I can't just turn back," Daniel said, his voice wavering. "There's something I need to find, something that's drawing me here." The old man shook his head slowly, a look of pity crossing his face. "That's what they all say. but no one ever finds what they're looking for. Not on this road. Silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. Daniel glanced back at the door, the overwhelming urge to leave suddenly pressing down on him. But before he could make a decision, the old man spoke again. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever you do, don't stop for anyone. Don't pick up any hitchhikers, and if you hear the voice again, don't answer it." Daniel's blood ran cold. The voice on the radio, how did the old man know about it? "What voice?" Daniel asked, his throat dry. The old man's eyes flickered with something close to fear. "The voice that calls out to you. It's not what you think it is. It's not someone asking for help. It's the road, trying to keep you." Daniel took a step back, his mind racing. The voice, the endless road, the disappearances. It all seemed like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to get out of here. Without another word, he turned and walked quickly back to his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his keys. The old man watched him go, his warning still echoing in Daniel's ears as he started the engine. He didn't look back as he pulled out of the gas station and onto the fog-covered road, but the feeling of being watched lingered long after the station had disappeared from view. The road stretched out before him once more, but now it felt different, more sinister, more dangerous. The old man's warning replayed in his mind over and over. Don't stop, don't pick up anyone, and don't answer the voice. As Daniel drove away from the gas station, the weight of the old man's warning sat heavy on his shoulders. The once unsettling road now felt outright menacing, the thick fog on either side of the highway seeming to close in around him. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he tried to push the old man's words out of his mind. Don't stop for anyone. Don't answer the voice. The radio remained silent, which only made the quiet hum of the car engine feel oppressive. Daniel's eyes flicked nervously from the road to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking behind him. But the road remained empty, devoid of any sign of life. It was just him, his car, and the endless stretch of black asphalt ahead. As the minutes ticked by, Daniel's tension began to ease slightly. Maybe the old man had just been crazy, spooked by living out here for too long. After all, no one could explain disappearances with something as intangible as a haunted road, right? But then, the radio crackled. It was faint at first, just a low hiss of static that could have been easily dismissed. But as Daniel's eyes darted toward the console, the static grew louder, more insistent. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his heart raced as he reached out and turned the dial, trying to switch it off. The radio didn't respond. The static grew louder still, and through the crackling noise, Daniel thought he could hear something. Words, distant and distorted. His breath hitched as he leaned closer to the radio, trying to make sense of the noise. "Help." The word was faint, barely audible beneath the static. Daniel's pulse quickened as he remembered the old man's warning. The voice that calls out to you. It's not someone asking for help. Help me. The voice came again, louder this time, clearer. It was a woman's voice, trembling with fear and desperation. Daniel's foot hesitated on the gas pedal as the sound filled the car. It was so convincing, so real, surely someone was in trouble. Maybe it was a coincidence, just a radio signal from a nearby station, but deep down, Daniel knew it wasn't. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. I can't," he muttered under his breath, as if speaking to the voice would make it go away. The static continued to buzz, and the woman's voice broke through again, this time more urgent. "Please, help me. I'm lost." Daniel's heart thudded in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving, to ignore it, but the voice was so compelling, so full of desperation. His mind raced, torn between the warning he had received and the human instinct to help someone in need. He opened his mouth to respond, but then the old man's final words came crashing back into his thoughts. "Don't answer the voice." Panic surged through him. His fingers twitched toward the volume knob, and he tried again to turn the radio off. It wouldn't budge. His car was filled with the static and the pleading voice, almost drowning out his own thoughts. "Please, It's so dark. I don't know where I am." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut for a brief moment, his knuckles turning white against the steering wheel. The voice tugged at his conscience, but there was something about it, something that felt wrong, unnatural. His foot pressed down harder on the accelerator. "Just keep driving. Don't listen. Don't stop." Suddenly, the voice changed. The desperation melted away, replaced by something colder, darker. "I know you can hear me, Daniel." His blood turned to ice. The voice on the radio had said his name. It wasn't a coincidence, wasn't a random signal. Whoever, or whatever, was speaking to him. It knew who he was. It knew he was listening. "I know you're out there, on this road, and I know why you're running." Daniel's breath came in short, panicked bursts. His pulse thundered in his ears as he kept his eyes glued to the road. The trees on either side seemed to close in, looming over him like twisted, gnarled hands. "I know what you did," the voice continued, its tone shifting to something almost mocking, taunting. "You can't hide from it, Daniel. Not forever." He clenched his teeth, trying to shut the voice out, but it was as if it was inside his mind now, echoing in his thoughts. "You think you can run from your past, that this road will lead you somewhere safe." The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness pressing in closer with each passing mile. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to keep control of the car and his sanity. "You don't even know where you're going, do you?" The voice's words were a cruel whisper, wrapping around him like a vice. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his fingers began to ache. "Just turn back, Daniel. It'll be easier. You can't escape what's waiting for you." Terror gripped him like a vice, and for a moment, Daniel considered turning the car around, speeding back to the gas station, back to some semblance of safety. But then he remembered the old man's warning. There was no turning back. With every ounce of willpower he had left, Daniel pressed down harder on the accelerator, speeding forward into the night. The voice on the radio laughed, a cold, echoing sound that sent shivers down his spine. "You can run, but you can't hide. We're all waiting for you, Daniel, just like we've waited for the others." As the laughter faded, the radio finally fell silent, but the unease that had settled deep in Daniel's bones refused to leave. Whatever was out there, whatever was waiting, it wasn't done with him yet. Daniel's hands trembled as he drove deeper into the night. The silence in the car felt heavier now, oppressive after the voice that had tormented him through the radio. His heart still raced, but his mind was filled with dread, each mile stretching endlessly before him, like an unwelcome dream that refused to end. He couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching him from the shadows that lined the highway. The trees along the roadside seemed taller now, their twisted branches swaying in the wind like skeletal fingers reaching out toward the car. He forced himself to focus on the road, but the darkness pressed in on all sides, making him feel as though the world had shrunk to the narrow beam of his headlights. The road stretched on, featureless and unchanging. Daniel glanced at his phone for the 100th time, hoping to catch a glimpse of some signal, something to connect him to the world he thought he knew. But the screen remained stubbornly dark, no bars of service in sight. He tossed it aside, frustration bubbling up inside him. "How is this even possible?" he muttered to himself, his voice sounding small and hollow in the confined space of the car. "Where the hell am I?" He hadn't seen another car for miles. The road seemed to have swallowed him whole, trapping him in its winding grip. No signs, no markers, no lights in the distance, just the same endless black pavement stretching into infinity. As the minutes turned into hours, Daniel's exhaustion began to wear on him. His eyes grew heavy, his mind clouded with fatigue. He fought to stay alert, shaking his head and gripping the wheel tighter, but the monotonous stretch of the road was taking its toll. Every time he blinked, it felt like the darkness pulled him deeper. And then, without warning, his headlights caught something up ahead. A figure. It stood on the side of the road, just beyond the reach of his high beams, a faint silhouette in the fog. Daniel's heart leapt into his throat. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as the car skidded to a halt. His pulse pounded in his ears as he stared through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure stood still, unmoving, shrouded in mist. For a moment he thought it might have been his imagination, a trick of the fog, perhaps, or his tired mind playing games with him. But no, it was real. Someone, or something, was there. Daniel's breath hitched in his throat as the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped into the beam of his headlights, revealing itself. It was a woman. Her clothes were torn, hanging loosely from her frail frame, her skin pale and almost translucent in the harsh light. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands over her face, and she looked like she had been walking for miles. But it wasn't her appearance that chilled Daniel to the core. It was the look in her eyes. They were empty, hollow, as though she were staring straight through him, not at him. Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing. Do I stop? Do I help her? The old man's warning echoed in his mind. Don't stop for anyone. But how could he just leave her there? She looked like she was lost, stranded in the middle of nowhere, just like him. His instincts screamed at him to keep driving, but the woman's hollow gaze held him captive. He cracked open the window, just slightly, his voice shaky. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman didn't respond. She simply stood there, staring at him, her eyes vacant, her body swaying slightly as if caught in some unseen current. A deep sense of unease settled over him. Something wasn't right. "I can give you a ride," Daniel said, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Just get in." The woman's head tilted slightly, as if considering his offer, but she made no move to approach the car. Instead, she lifted a hand, slowly, as if weighed down by something, and pointed down the road. Daniel followed her gesture, squinting into the distance, but he saw nothing, just more of the same endless stretch of highway disappearing into the fog. He turned back to her, confusion written across his face. What is it?" Her lips parted, and for the first time, she spoke. "You need to go back." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a weight that made Daniel's skin crawl. There was no anger, no fear in her tone, just a cold, detached certainty that sent shivers down his spine. "Go back where?" he asked, but the question felt absurd. He knew where she was pointing. Back to the gas station, back to the old man and his cryptic warnings, back to where everything had started. The woman didn't answer. She simply lowered her hand and turned away, walking slowly back into the fog, her figure disappearing into the mist as silently as she had appeared. Daniel sat frozen in the driver's seat, his heart pounding. His mind was screaming at him to turn around, to heed her warning, but something inside him refused. He couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. "She's just trying to scare you," he told himself, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "Keep driving. You have to keep driving." With a deep breath, he put the car in gear and pressed down on the accelerator, his tires kicking up dust as he sped forward into the darkness. But as the fog swallowed him once again, a sickening feeling settled in his gut. He couldn't shake the woman's voice from his mind. Go back. Go. The road seemed to stretch on forever, unchanging, as if mocking his determination to keep moving forward. The trees loomed larger, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. The darkness pressed in closer, suffocating him. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he saw something up ahead. A light. His heart leapt in his chest as he squinted through the windshield, trying to make out what it was. A building. A house. Relief surged through him at the thought of finally finding some sign of civilization. But as the light grew closer, Daniel's blood ran cold. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a town. It was the gas station, the same one he had left hours ago. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest as the gas station's flickering lights came into view. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. It wasn't possible. He had driven straight for hours. He couldn't have looped back here. And yet, there it was, unmistakable in its isolation, with its dim lights casting eerie shadows against the dark forest. No. No, 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 Daniel muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. He slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching against the asphalt as the car came to a halt. His breathing was shallow, panic rising in his throat. How was he back here? Hadn't he driven far enough to escape? The gas station stood there, silent and haunting. It looked exactly as it had before, run down, weathered by time, the pumps covered in rust. The small convenience store's neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an unsettling glow over the parking lot. For a moment, Daniel thought about turning the car around and driving back the way he came, but a cold, creeping realization began to settle in the pit of his stomach. No matter what direction he drove, he would always end up back here. This place had him trapped, caught in some kind of impossible loop. The old man's words echoed in his mind, chilling him to the bone. You can't outrun it. No one ever does. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. What now? He couldn't stay in the car forever. The suffocating darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, urging him to make a decision. He had to go back inside. With shaky hands, Daniel turned off the ignition and stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting him like a slap to the face. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked toward the gas station, the familiar dread settling in with each step. The door swung open with a creak as Daniel stepped inside. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering sporadically. The shelves were still stocked with old, dusty goods, as if no one had touched them in years. The air smelled stale, a mixture of mildew and gasoline. And there, standing behind the counter, was the old man. He looked exactly as he had before, tall, thin, his face weathered and lined with age, his eyes clouded with a weariness that sent shivers down Daniel's spine. The old man didn't speak at first. He simply stared at Daniel, as if he had been expecting him all along. "I told you," the old man finally rasped, his voice low and gravelly. "You can't leave. No one does." Daniel's heart sank. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he say? He had ignored the warning, driven straight into whatever trap this place had set for him. And now, it seemed, there was no way out. The old man slowly stepped around the counter and approached Daniel, his gait slow and deliberate, as if every step carried the weight of years of regret. "This road," the man said, his voice hollow, "it doesn't lead anywhere. It only takes you in circles. No matter how far you drive, how fast you go, you always come back here." Daniel shook his head, his voice trembling. "Why? Why is this happening? What is this place?" The old man sighed, his eyes filled with a sorrow that made Daniel's skin crawl. "This place, it's a trap. It takes those who don't belong, who are lost, and it keeps them forever." Daniel's chest tightened, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. "That doesn't make any sense. I just wanted to get home. I didn't do anything wrong." The old man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not, but that doesn't matter. This road takes anyone who travels it. It doesn't care who you are or what you've done." Daniel took a step back, his mind racing. Was he really doomed to be trapped here forever? Was there no way out? He couldn't accept that. He wouldn't. "There has to be a way to escape," Daniel said, his voice desperate. "There's always a way out." The old man shook his head, his face grim. "Not here." Suddenly, the radio behind the counter crackled to life, emitting the same static-filled hum that had tormented Daniel earlier. The sound made his stomach twist in knots. It was the same unnerving voice he had heard on the road, distorted and barely recognizable, whispering words he couldn't quite understand. The old man didn't seem to notice the noise. He continued staring at Daniel, his eyes distant. "We're all trapped here, Daniel. You, me, and the others." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Others?" The old man's gaze shifted toward the back of the store, where the shadows seemed to grow thicker, darker. "The ones who came before you, the ones who thought they could leave, they're still here, They always will be. Daniel felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. His eyes darted toward the back of the store, where the shadows swirled ominously, like something was moving within them. He took an involuntary step back, his body tense with fear. "No," Daniel whispered. "This can't be real. This can't be happening." The old man sighed again, his voice filled with resignation. "It's real, all right. More real than you'll ever know." Daniel's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. If the road was a trap, if he couldn't escape, then what was he supposed to do? Just give up and accept his fate? No. He couldn't. He wouldn't. "There has to be a way out," Daniel said again, more to himself than to the old man. His voice was shaky, but there was a glimmer of determination in his eyes. "I'm not staying here, I refuse." The old man watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back behind the counter, his footsteps echoing in the empty store. Daniel stood frozen for a moment, his thoughts racing. He couldn't stay here. He had to find a way out, no matter what the old man said. There had to be something he was missing, some way to break the loop. His eyes scanned the store, looking for any clue, any sign of an escape. But all he saw were the same shelves, the same worn-out products, the same dim lights flickering overhead. And then he noticed it, a door at the back of the store, partially hidden behind a stack of dusty boxes. A surge of hope shot through him. Maybe that was it. Maybe the door led to something, somewhere outside of this cursed place. Without hesitation, Daniel walked toward the door, his footsteps quick and determined. He reached for the handle, his heart pounding in his chest. But just as his fingers brushed the cold metal, the old man's voice rang out behind him, cold and sharp. "You won't like what's on the other side, dog boy." Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. His pulse raced as the weight of the warning settled in, but he couldn't turn back now. He had come too far. Ignoring the old man's words, Daniel turned the handle and pushed the door open. The darkness beyond the threshold was absolute. The door creaked open, revealing a yawning abyss of darkness beyond. Daniel hesitated for only a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped forward. The air on the other side was heavy, thick with an oppressive weight that clung to his skin like damp fog. He reached out, hoping to feel a wall or some kind of surface, but his fingers met only empty air. The door clicked shut behind him. Suddenly, the darkness wasn't just dark, it was suffocating. The sound of his own breathing echoed unnaturally loud in his ears, as if the void were amplifying every movement, every sound. His heart raced as he stumbled forward, his steps uncertain. The floor beneath his feet felt uneven, as if the ground itself was shifting and warping under him. "Hello?" His voice came out hoarse, swallowed up by the blackness. No response, only the deafening silence of the void. Daniel pressed on, forcing himself to move forward even though his every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But turn back to what? The gas station was no refuge, and the road was a dead end. This door, this darkness, it had to lead somewhere, didn't it? As he moved deeper into the void, something began to change. The darkness seemed to ripple, twisting and warping in ways that made his head spin. Shapes began to form within the blackness, faint at first, like shadows moving just beyond the reach of his vision, and then they became clearer. Faces. Human faces. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The faces floated in the darkness, pale and ghostly, their features distorted in ways that defied reason. Eyes that were too large, mouths twisted in grotesque, unnatural expressions. They stared at him, their hollow eyes filled with silent accusation. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. No, this isn't real. But the faces didn't vanish. They loomed closer, their mouths moving soundlessly, as if trying to speak but unable to form the words. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, willing them to disappear. When he opened them again, the faces were gone, but the oppressive feeling remained, as if something unseen was watching him, waiting. Then, out of the darkness, a voice echoed, a voice that chilled him to the bone. "Daniel." He froze. The voice was faint, barely a whisper, but he recognized it immediately. It was the voice of the last patient. His mind reeled, memories flashing before him in rapid succession. The hospital, the last moments of the patient's life, the mistake that had haunted him for years. How could the voice be here? How could the past be chasing him through this nightmare? "Daniel," the voice called again, this time louder, more insistent. "You can't run from me." He spun around, searching the void for the source of the voice. "Who's there? What do you want from me?" There was no answer, only silence. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Daniel saw something. A figure, standing just at the edge of his vision. It was the silhouette of a man, tall and thin, barely visible in the swirling shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The darkness seemed to twist and writhe around it, as if the void itself were alive and bending to its will. As the figure approached, Daniel could make out more details. The man's face was obscured by shadows, but his clothes, an old hospital gown, tattered and worn, were unmistakable. The last patient... No. Daniel stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. "This isn't possible. You're dead. You can't be here." The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly, as if considering Daniel's words. And then, in a voice that was cold and emotionless, it spoke. "I am dead, but so are you." Daniel's blood ran cold. What? What are you talking about?" The figure stepped closer, and for the first time, Daniel could see its face clearly. It was the face of the last patient, but twisted, contorted with pain and anger. His skin was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, as if the life had been drained from him long ago. "You never left, Daniel," the patient said, his voice echoing through the void. "You've been here all along, trapped, just like me." "No," Daniel whispered, shaking his head. "That's not true. I left. I moved on. I lived my life." The patient's twisted smile sent a chill down Daniel's spine. "Did you? Or is this all just part of your punishment?" The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Punishment. The word echoed in his mind, reverberating through his thoughts like a curse. Could it be true? Could he really have been trapped here all this time, reliving the same nightmare over and over? His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. He had left the hospital, hadn't he? He had lived his life, moved on from the mistake, or so he had believed. But now, standing here in this suffocating darkness, face to face with the patient he had failed, doubts began to creep in. The patient stepped closer, his cold, dead eyes boring into Daniel's. "You can't run from your guilt, Daniel. You can't hide from the truth." Daniel backed away, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to remember," the patient said, his voice a chilling whisper. "Remember what you did. Remember how you let me die." The memories came flooding back all at once. The sterile hospital room, the patient's labored breathing, the beeping of the machines as they flatlined, the mistake, the fatal mistake that had cost the patient his life. Daniel had tried to forget, to bury the guilt deep inside, but now, here in the darkness, there was no escaping it. "I'm sorry," Daniel choked out, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." The patient's twisted smile faded, replaced by a cold, empty stare. "But it's too late for sorry." The void around them began to shift and ripple, the darkness growing thicker, more suffocating. Daniel's chest tightened as the air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on him from all sides. He could feel the weight of his guilt, crushing him, suffocating him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the void began to fade. The darkness lifted, and Daniel found himself standing in the middle of the gas station once again. The shelves, the flickering lights, the dusty products, all of it exactly as it had been before. But something was different. The old man was gone. The radio was silent, and outside, through the grimy windows, Daniel could see his car still parked in the lot. But the weight of the truth remained. He wasn't leaving. He never had. He was part of this place now, just like the old man, just like the others who had come before. He had been trapped all along. Daniel stood frozen in the gas station, his mind reeling from the revelation. The old man's words, the confrontation with the patient, it all swirled in his head like a dark, oppressive fog. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he gripped the counter for support. The once flickering lights now felt harsher, casting long, eerie shadows across the shelves. The truth weighed heavily on him. "I'm dead," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible, as if saying them aloud would make them more real. His legs felt weak beneath him, the ground seeming less solid with every passing moment. Memories began to surface, each one more painful than the last. The day of the accident, the mistakes, the life he thought he had moved on from, it all felt like a distant dream. He had never really escaped. Had he? This place, this road, had held him captive all along, feeding on his guilt, drawing him back to the one thing he could never forgive himself for. Daniel slowly made his way to the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He wasn't sure why. There was nowhere else to go. But the pull to leave, to try to break free from this place, was overwhelming. As he pushed the door open, a rush of cold night air hit him, stinging his face. The road stretched out before him, bathed in the dim glow of the gas station's lights. His car sat there, untouched, as if waiting for him to continue the journey that now seemed meaningless. He stepped outside, feeling the gravel crunch beneath his shoes. Everything looked the same as it had when he first arrived, but there was an emptiness to it now, a hollowness that echoed in the stillness of the night. "You can't leave." The voice stopped him in his tracks. Daniel turned to see the old man standing just outside the station, his weathered face emotionless. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, as if waiting for Daniel to come to the inevitable conclusion. "You were never meant to leave," the old man continued, his tone flat, matter-of-fact. "No one does." Daniel's chest tightened. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The old man shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "A place for those who can't let go. A place for those who carry the weight of their sins, their mistakes, with them. This road, this gas station, it's a trap, a cycle that never ends." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. "So, I'm stuck here? Forever?" The old man nodded slowly. "Until you accept it." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Accept it. Accept that this was his fate, that he had been condemned to relive this moment, this place, over and over again. It was too much to bear. "I can't," Daniel's voice broke. "I can't stay here. There has to be a way out." The old man's gaze softened, just for a moment. "You think I haven't tried? I've been where you are now, fighting, searching for a way out, but it always comes back to this. You can't outrun yourself." Daniel's mind raced, searching for something, anything, that could offer him hope. But deep down he knew the old man was right. There was no escape from the guilt, from the mistake that had defined his entire existence. He had been running from it for so long, and now there was nowhere left to run. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of the neon sign overhead. "Then what?" Daniel asked, his voice hollow. "What happens now?" The old man pushed himself off the wall and walked toward Daniel, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, his weathered face illuminated by the dim glow of the gas station's lights. "You make peace with it," the old man said, his voice low. "You accept what you've done, who you are, and you let it go. Only then does the cycle end." Daniel stared at the old man, his mind reeling. Could it really be that simple? Could he just let go? After all these years, after all the pain and guilt, could he truly forgive himself for the mistakes he had made? The weight of his guilt bore down on him like a physical force, but beneath it, there was something else. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The realization hit him like a wave. He had been trapped not by the road, not by the gas station, but by his own guilt, his refusal to forgive himself for what had happened. The road, the gas station, the patient, they were all manifestations of his own torment. Slowly, Daniel sank to the ground, the gravel rough beneath him. He bowed his head, his hands trembling in his lap. The memories of that day, the day he had made the fatal mistake, played out in his mind one final time. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the patient, to the old man, or to himself. "I'm so sorry." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. The air felt lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted. Daniel closed his eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. He could feel it now, the release. The chains that had bound him to this place were loosening, the cycle beginning to break. When he opened his eyes again, the old man was gone. The gas station, the road, everything around him seemed to blur, fading into the background. The heavy, oppressive darkness that had clung to him for so long was lifting, replaced by a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, Daniel smiled. And then, as the world around him dissolved into nothingness, he whispered, "I forgive myself." The road, the gas station, the patient, all of it faded away, leaving only the stillness of the night and the quiet peace that came with letting go. If you liked it, comment below, like and subscribe.